Hello and welcome to week 8 of American Government. This week we're going to concentrate on Missouri's Constitution and the government that we have in this state. Up to this point, we've been taking a look primarily at government on the national level. However, we also are charged with teaching you about state and local government too. And so that's what we're going to talk about this week is looking at government at the state and local level, mainly by examining Missouri's government. You might ask yourself, why do we care that much about Missouri's government? Well, a number of different reasons. For one thing, there is a state law in Missouri that the legislature requires all graduates of public colleges and universities to have a familiarity with Missouri's Constitution and government. And so you have to either take the early American history course that covers this or the government class at Crater. And one of those two will get you acquainted with the Constitution of Missouri. And so I am fulfilling my obligation under state law to tell you about the Missouri Constitution. So that's one thing. However, it's important to know about all levels of our system too. And we know that we have a federal system, and the federal government is only one aspect of that. We also have state governments all over the place, and they create local governments too. And by looking at Missouri, that's a window to us into how other states work too, because most other states work very similarly to how Missouri works. And so even if you live in a different state, even if you are native to a different state, or you're going to move out of state as soon as this class is over, it doesn't really matter. Just by looking at Missouri's state government, you'll have a pretty good idea of how any state government is constructed, and you wouldn't have a complete knowledge of how our system works in the United States if you didn't understand both the national and the state level of government. So that's why we're going to delve into this at this point. Up to this point in the class, we've mainly been looking at the United States Constitution and different aspects that it sets up, three branches of government, the Bill of Rights, all that kind of thing. Well, states have constitutions as well. Most states began life as basically large tracts of mostly open country inhabited only by Native Americans. Gradually, as the United States expanded, of course, we had the colonists landing on the East Coast, and they, kind of started pushing west. And so as they did, and kicked the Native Americans off their land by and large, they opened up these areas to settlement by American citizens. And when they did that at first, they would try to organize these territories in some kind of, have some sort of government out there when enough people would move in. And at first, they were called territories. And that meant that we had a government there, but it didn't really have any kind of independent existence or sovereignty like a state would. It was still pretty much run by the federal government in Washington, but we would set up some kind of territorial government to kind of take care of those local issues, the law and order kinds of things, the stuff that we would normally depend on a state government to do, but we didn't really have a state yet because there weren't enough people living there and we hadn't set up a full-fledged state. Territories, however, did have constitutions, which were usually written by the leading citizens of the territory at some kind of constitutional convention, kind of like the Constitutional Convention, only on a smaller scale. And so they would come up with some kind of blueprint for a territorial government to kind of run the show there, along with help from the national government back in Washington. Once we had enough people actually settle in the territory, usually what would happen is they would petition Congress to be admitted to the Union as a full-fledged state. And there would be an application process to this, and part of that was submitting a proposed state constitution to the Congress for consideration. The constitution that would be the first for this state could not contain any provisions conflicting with the federal constitution, so they had to be careful of that. Often they would use a territorial constitution that they already had as the basis for the first state constitution. But however they did it, they would send this to Congress, and if Congress approved, they would take a vote, and then the state would be admitted to the Union, and the document submitted to Congress would become the state's first constitution. Looking specifically at Missouri now, Missouri was originally part of the Louisiana Territory that was owned by France. And that was a territory, a huge swath of North America that was kind of started at New Orleans and went straight north from there along the western banks of the Mississippi River, and then also northwest, and kind of this huge slice of North America and went up into Canada, basically. And so that was purchased from France in 1803. Thomas Jefferson's administration took that over. And so the land that is now Missouri was part of the Louisiana Territory. Well, Missouri itself was opened up as a territory early on after that Louisiana Purchase, and was then admitted as a state in 1821. And the first Missouri Constitution that we had was adopted in that same year. Well, unlike the United States Constitution, which is still the original document that was adopted in 1789, has been amended only 27 times in well over 200 years, state constitutions are frequently changed. We just don't have the reverence for the state constitutions that we do for the federal constitution, so we have no qualms at all about taking out a red pen, changing things we don't like, or just replacing them altogether. And that happens surprisingly frequently throughout our history. In fact, most states have gone through several complete rewrites of their constitutions over their history. And for whatever reason, it seems that Americans hold the United States Constitution in a special kind of reverence. They are deeply afraid of screwing up something that has worked so well for so long. We kind of, we have a copy of that on display in the National Archives. It's under thick glass and stored in a special nitrogen gas and all that kind of stuff. We just kind of almost, I hate to say the word worship, but we almost have this special kind of reference for the U.S. Constitution. It's kind of holy or something. We just have a real fear of kind of messing up what the Founding Fathers did. Well, state constitutions don't get that kind of respect. They are just amended constantly. They're often replaced entirely. And so we just do not hold them with the same degree of reverence and respect. And so we're not afraid of replacing them. And so that has happened in a lot of states. They'll just replace their constitution entirely, and it's also happened in Missouri. Missouri has gone through several different constitutions over its history. They were drafted by constitutional conventions, not all that different from the Constitutional Convention, which we already looked at, that wrote the U.S. Constitution. Same kind of idea. The smart leading citizens of the state will gather together and try to figure out a constitution, and that's happened a couple different times. People across the state would elect representatives of their areas to meet at a central place and draft some new document. And it would then be put to a vote of the people in order to be adopted as the new Constitution. And if the people voted for it, then that would be our new Constitution. As we said, Missouri's first Constitution was in 1821, which was when Missouri entered the Union. And that lasted until just after the Civil War. Missouri was a slave state. It did not secede and join the Confederacy, however. It stayed with the Union, but we did have slavery in the state of Missouri. Well, after the war, a new constitution was drafted to reflect the new situation. Of course, slavery had been abolished, the process of Reconstruction was underway, and rights were extended to former slaves. And so the Constitution was changed to reflect that reality. Reconstruction lasted only until the 1870s. We looked at this when we talked about civil liberties and civil rights. But during this time, many southern states rewrote their constitutions to eliminate some progressive provisions designed to help former slaves. And right after the Civil War, the federal government, was kind of stepped in and made sure the states respected the rights of their former slaves. And then they kind of lost interest and went back north and left the southern states to their own devices. And as soon as the Yankees were out of the way, a lot of the southern states started kind of changing their constitutions to be mean to their former slaves and their descendants again. So unfortunately, that happened in Missouri too. So a lot of new constitutions across the southern U.S. former slave states were drafted, which had those Jim Crow kind of provisions designed to keep blacks as in a political second class. And Missouri adopted one of those constitutions in 1875. So we did have some changes over time. We won't spend too much time talking about constitutions that we don't currently have. Missouri's fourth and current constitution was adopted in 1945, just after World War II. And so we're going to spend the rest of the class examining how that constitution operates. Even though we've stuck with that one constitutional document, it's been amended over 75 times. And a new amendment, not amended, comes along every year or two and changes it again. So that's kind of hard to keep up with, but as we stated earlier, we just have less concern about changing state constitutions. They just aren't near and dear to us like the U.S. Constitution is. We just don't have that reverence and respect for state constitutions. We feel like we can change them if we want to. Also, it's much easier to pass an amendment to most state constitutions. We didn't really talk about this too much, but to amend the U.S. Constitution, we've only had 27 amendments in more than 200 years of history. One reason that we've kept that number so low is it's really hard to do. To get an amendment to the U.S. Constitution, most of the time we have to go through Congress, which is passed by a supermajority in Congress, 2/3, and then is ratified by 3/4 of the states. So really, really hard to get 3/4 of everybody to agree on anything. And so very tough to get a constitutional amendment passed. Well, in Missouri, it's much easier to amend our Constitution. We just have to get it passed by a majority vote, basically. And so if we can get 50% plus one people to agree on something, we can change our Constitution. So not all that difficult to change. When we have amendments to the federal Constitution, they are neatly numbered sequentially and tacked on to the end of the document. That is not how amending the Missouri Constitution works. And if you look at the amendments to the federal Constitution, we'll have the First Amendment, the Second Amendment, and we'll just kind of tack those on the end. We won't take a red pen and go scratch through things that the Founding Fathers wrote. We're just not willing to do that. But the Missouri Constitution, it's kind of like your English teacher when they're grading your research paper. We'll just go in with a red pen and cross things out and pencil things in and just make changes. And so we will cross out existing language. We'll insert phrases into the middle of sentences. We'll make these kind of edits to the body of the text. And so we don't have numbered, nice, cute little amendments at the end of the document. We will just go make edits and changes to the document as it exists. So if you look at the Missouri Constitution, there's really no list of numbered amendments at the end. They're just blended in with the rest of the text. And that's another sign of the lower esteem that we hold state constitutions in. We're just not really willing to do that to the federal Constitution because we respect it more, but we'll gladly take out our red pen and start making changes to the Missouri Constitution whenever we feel like it. Now let's start looking at the actual text of the Missouri Constitution. The first thing we have is the preamble. And like the federal Constitution, the Missouri Constitution has one of these. The preamble to the U.S. Constitution is probably familiar to you. It starts out, "We the people, in order to form a more perfect union, Kind of just sets up the purpose of why we have the Constitution. Why did we write it? What were we hoping to achieve when we adopted it? And the Missouri Constitution was written for the same reasons. It's this one that we have now is the same one that we had in the original 1821 Constitution. So the Constitution itself has changed, but we've kept the same preamble. It simply reads, "We, the people of Missouri, with profound reverence for the supreme ruler of the universe and grateful for his goodness, do establish this Constitution for the better government of the state." So some kind of old-timey, flowery language in there, but pretty short and simple. They were just trying to make a better government for the state of Missouri, and so that's what they were up to when they were writing the Constitution. Like the federal Constitution, the Missouri Constitution is divided up into big sections called articles, and Article 1 is the Missouri Bill of Rights. Just like the federal Constitution has a Bill of Rights, state constitutions often do too. They'll have a list of guaranteed individual rights and freedoms, and Missouri is no exception to that. Those used to be much more important and meaningful than they are now. Remember, before we had the incorporation doctrine, the federal Bill of Rights and the U.S. Constitution gave us no protection from state governments. And so the First Amendment to the federal Constitution might prohibit the federal government from interfering with our freedom of religion or speech, but there was nothing to stop a state government from doing that. Of course, after the Supreme Court came up with the incorporation doctrine, most of the Bill of Rights in the federal Constitution applies to state governments too. But before that, state bills of rights were essential to protect their government or citizens from a state government that was kind of overreaching there. The Missouri Bill of Rights does contain protections that are not found in the federal Constitution's Bill of Rights. For example, there's a guarantee for our right to collectively bargain, which means form a labor union, basically. Also, there is some mention of protections for the rights of crime victims and how they will be treated. So there are some things in there that you won't find in the U.S. Constitution. For the most part, though, the text is very similar to the Federal Bill of Rights. You'll see things about unreasonable search and seizure, just like in the Fourth Amendment, and so on. So a lot of it's derivative of the Federal Bill of Rights, but there are some interesting things in there, too. Well, moving on to Article 2, and that talks about the separation of powers. It's extremely brief, extremely to the point. It just says that power in Missouri state government will be split among 3 equal branches of government. And of course, we have the same thing going on in the federal government, too. And the U.S. Constitution doesn't really come out and say it that bluntly, though, but in Missouri, we do. So that's Article 2, pretty brief and to the point. In Article 3, we really start to get into the nuts and bolts of the Missouri Constitution. And this sets up the state legislature. Like the federal government, Missouri has 3 branches of government, of course, and the legislative functions are given to our state legislature, which we call the General Assembly. And this is a bicameral legislature, which means it has two houses. It has a House of Representatives and a Senate, so again, kind of mirroring its federal counterpart there. The House is composed of 163 members who are elected to two-year terms. Every House member is up for re-election every 2 years, and so theoretically we could have 163 brand new people elected every 2 years if we wanted to. The districts that they represent are drawn after every census with the idea of splitting the population of Missouri up evenly 163 different ways. And so that's the idea. So every representative will represent roughly the same number of people. District lines are drawn without regard to county lines and city limits. And so a House member can represent people in parts of several different counties. Sometimes those district boundaries will snake around kind of funny, trying to get the same number of people in each one. But that's how they try to do it. That's how they try to draw those boundaries. To become a member of the Missouri House, you have to be at least 24 years old, a Missouri voter for 2 years, and a resident of your district for 1 year. So not that hard to meet those qualifications, really. Unlike congressmen at the federal level, members of the Missouri House face term limits. If you're going to be elected to the U.S. Congress, you can be reelected again and again as many times as you want to, as long as people keep voting for you. Not in Missouri, though. To our General Assembly, we have term limits, and members are only allowed to serve a total of 4 terms in the House during their lifetimes. And so 4 terms times a 2-year term, so 8 years total that they can serve in the House before they will be forced to retire from the General Assembly, or at least the House of Representatives in the General Assembly. And so they can be elected and then reelected 3 times before they are forced to find something else to do with their time. And so that ensures that there's a constant amount of turnover. Being a member of the General Assembly is intended to be a part-time job. We kind of expect a member of Congress to go to Washington, and that's the only thing that they do. Not so with our General Assembly in Jefferson City. They're only in session for a few months every year. Sessions usually begin in September and end in May with several breaks in between, and so they'll have a lot of time off, and they can kind of figure out their own meeting times to a degree. But they don't spend their entire life in Jeff City making laws for the state of Missouri. So they are often have some kind of outside employment, and that's only kind of a part-time job for them. And so they're not rewarded that handsomely. They make decent money, about $35,000 a year as they make this presentation. But, that's not huge money. If you're a lawyer or a doctor or some other kind of professional, even a realtor or whatever, you can earn a lot more than that usually in a year. And so it's kind of considered to be a part-time job, and they're kind of compensated accordingly to that. Most people can't just drop what they're doing and head to Jeff City for half the year. So the assembly schedule effectively limits who can serve. If you're working, punching a clock, making chairs at Lazy Boy or something, you can't just say, hey boss, I'm going to go start writing laws in Jeff City. I'll see you in a few months, So that limits the type of folks who can usually run for that type of office, because it's only a part-time job, doesn't pay that well, really. So many, if not most, of the members of the assembly have professions that allow them to kind of pick their own hours. And so you see a lot of insurance agents, lawyers, other professionals who may be in business for themselves, where they can choose their own hours, and they're able to put their full-time jobs on hold long enough to serve. And so they can kind of work that in as kind of a part-time commitment. And so that's a lot of the time, that's who you'll see serving in the Missouri General Assembly, or professionals like that who can kind of work that into their schedule. Well, the upper house of the General Assembly is the Missouri Senate. There are only 34 state senators. The districts they represent aren't all that different from the districts that House members represent. They are just bigger. So we will draw those big snaky lines, around trying to divide the state population up. They ignore county lines and city limits again, and are drawn with the idea of splitting the state's population equally 34 different ways. So it's just kind of like the same thing as a Missouri House district, is just a little bit bigger. And so that's how that works. To be a senator, you have to be 30 years old, a Missouri voter, and a resident of the district for 1 year. Again, not that hard to do. Senators serve 4-year terms rather than 2. And the election of senators is staggered, just like the U.S. Senate. And so not all of them are up for re-election at the same time. We'll always have some experienced senators on the job, because we don't force them all to stand for re-election at the same in the same year. Senators also face term limits. They are allowed to serve no more than 2 of these 4-year terms. So again, only 8 years in the Senate is all that you're allowed to serve. And again, serving the legislature is a part-time job, so we see the same sorts of folks typically run for office in the General Assembly, either the House or the Senate. The Missouri Constitution establishes 3 leadership positions within the General Assembly. We have a Speaker of the House who presides over the House of Representatives, very much like at the federal level. The Speaker has a very powerful position, can kind of control the House's agenda and the bills that come up for votes and things like that. The Speaker is elected by the other House members, and just like at the federal level, he always ends up being a member of the majority party. So if there's more Republicans, there will be a Republican Speaker. If there's more Democrats, there will be a Democratic Speaker, etc. The Constitution also states that the President of the Missouri Senate is the Lieutenant Governor of Missouri. And this is just like at the federal level, where we have the Vice President of the United States presiding over the U.S. Senate. Same idea. The Lieutenant Governor is the number 2 in the executive branch of Missouri, and so he's in charge of the Missouri Senate. And just like in the U.S. Senate, the President of the Senate, i.e. the Lieutenant Governor, does not get to vote unless it's to break a tie. In the absence of the Lieutenant Governor, the Senate is run by the President pro tem, who is an actual voting member of the Senate and who is elected by his fellow senators. And so kind of exactly the same situation we have at the federal level. As we mentioned, the General Assembly usually only meets for about half of the year. However, the governor has the power to call them back to Jeff City for what's called a special session, if they need to meet about something outside of the normal meeting time that they would usually have. Could be done in a situation where there's some kind of urgent problem facing the state that needs to be addressed right away. For example, let's say the state experienced some kind of natural disaster. There was a New Madrid earthquake or something, and the legislature is the one that writes the checks, and so the governor might need extra funds to deal with this disaster, so we would call all the legislators back to the Capitol to consider some kind of emergency funding bill. And so the governor has the power to kind of pull them back to the Capitol to deal with some kind of crisis situation. Also, the Assembly itself has a procedure for calling itself into special session in order to consider particular bills, but such sessions can't last more than 10 days. And so basically they can kind of petition themselves and everyone signs up and we want to have a special session, and then they can call one. And so there's a procedure to do that if they need to meet outside of their normal meeting time. Most of Missouri's laws are created much like those on the federal level, which we've already looked at extensively in the Congress chapter. Bills begin in either the House or the Senate. They go through a very similar committee process, and then they'll go to the other house, where we have a compromise version passed and sent to the governor, who can sign the bill into law or veto it. So very similar kind of process in Missouri, kind of mirrors what happens on the federal level. However, Missouri does have some interesting things going on. There are alternative ways to create a law that we don't see at the federal level. If the General Assembly wants to pass a law, but they know that the governor will never sign that bill into law, they can pass the bill through both houses and then put it to a referendum, which is a vote of the people. And so they will approve this bill and then let the people decide whether or not they want it and let the people actually vote on it. And the people will go to the polls at the next election, and if a simple majority vote for the bill, it will become law without the governor ever signing it. And so that's a way that they can kind of do an end run around the governor. If the governor's not wanting to play ball on this particular bill, they can just bypass him completely. Amendments to Missouri's Constitution can also be put to a vote in this way. And amendments to the Constitution can begin in the General Assembly and then be put to a vote of the people, just like a regular referendum. And if a simple majority of voters vote for the amendment, it becomes part of the state constitution. While constitutional amendments are much harder to undo than just a regular law. A regular law can be amended or repealed in the next General Assembly, even if it was passed through a referendum. But a constitutional amendment can only be repealed by another constitutional amendment. And so it's kind of harder to undo a constitutional amendment. And so sometimes, for various reasons, they will want to amend the Constitution to do something rather than just pass a normal law this way. Interestingly, laws can also be created by the people themselves, bypassing the General Assembly and the governor entirely. And so the people of Missouri can write our own laws if we want to without using any of these elected officials that we sent to Jefferson City. And that's done through something called the initiative process. That's where somebody comes up with a proposed law, just a regular citizen maybe, and then gathers enough signatures on a petition in order to put that proposed law on the ballot in the next general election. And there is a complex formula for determining how many signatures they actually need, but it'll be a lot, probably into the thousands that they would need voters to sign this petition. If, however, they collect enough signatures and those are verified as real voters, then that measure will be put on the ballot. And if a simple majority of voters vote for that proposed law in the next election, it will become law without any involvement by the legislature at all. And this method has been used many times to make laws that just can't get enough support in the General Assembly to pass. Some examples would include a minimum wage increase that was enacted several years ago, and the General Assembly just didn't support that idea. There was enough business interests that had other ideas that didn't want a minimum wage hike, but it was popular enough that people voted for it in the election, and so they raised the minimum wage themselves without going through the governor or the General Assembly. Term limits were imposed on the legislators this way. We talked about how they can only serve a certain number of terms in the state legislature. Well, they weren't going to vote in favor of that themselves. Most people who get voted into office like being in office. They like serving in the General Assembly, and so they weren't going to kick themselves out, basically. And so that came through an initiative process. An initiative can propose either a regular law or a constitutional amendment, either one. Since it's so easy to pass amendments to the Constitution either by a referendum or an initiative, you can see why we've ended up with so many of them. They're just not that large a barrier to messing with the Missouri Constitution, and so it gets changed pretty frequently. Article 4 deals with the executive branch, Missouri's answer to the president and his cabinet and the vice president and all that stuff at the federal level. And while Missouri's executive branch mirrors its federal counterpart in some ways. In some ways, it varies a lot from what we see at the federal level. The chief executive is the governor, kind of Missouri's answer to the president, who serves a maximum of 2 4-year terms. To be the governor, you have to be at least 30 years old, a Missouri or a U.S. citizen for 15 years, and a citizen of the state of Missouri. So again, the qualifications are not that tough. Governor makes a pretty good salary, around $133,000 a year. Last I checked, he does get a raise every now and again. Has some other perks too. He gets to live in the governor's mansion, which is Missouri's answer to the White House, basically. He doesn't have the Secret Service, but he gets protection from state troopers. So he does have a few perks that come with the job. When we talk about what the governor actually does, Missouri's Constitution is kind of vague about that. It says that he first must faithfully execute the laws of Missouri, and second, be a conservator of the peace, which sounds very important, but it's kind of hard to figure out exactly what that means. Presumably, that second part means that one of his chief duties is maintaining law and order across the state of Missouri, making sure that everyone is safe and secure in their homes and property and everything else. Aside from those very general directives, the governor does have some specific powers. Like the president at the federal level, he gets to make some appointments. Remember, the president gets to appoint thousands of people to various federal jobs. The governor gets to make some appointments also to head various agencies and serve on state commissions and boards. As we will see in a little bit, his appointment power is not nearly as good as the president's, but he does get to make some appointments in state government. The governor also serves as commander-in-chief of the state militia, which in the modern day is the Missouri National Guard. The governor has the power to deploy the National Guard within the state. Usually he will do that to deal with some kind of natural disaster, a flood or a tornado aftermath or something like that. If there were a great deal of civil unrest, such as riots, the governor would deploy them for that purpose as well. Unfortunately, not too long ago, the city of Ferguson around St. Louis had all kinds of riots and unrest, and so the National Guard was called out for that to kind of restore order and help the police kind of keep control of the situation. And so that situation, called for the National Guard, and the governor was able to deploy that. In modern times, the governor must relinquish control of the National Guard if they are needed to serve the country. In other words, they can fight alongside the Army, the regular Army troops, if the country goes to war. The president has the power to federalize the Guard, which means that the president of the United States will take over the Missouri National Guard and then deploy them in defense of the country. And so that process has been used in the recent past to send Guard units to Iraq and Afghanistan, for example. But if the president doesn't interfere and do that, the governor serves as the commander-in-chief of the Missouri National Guard. And so, again, kind of mirrors what the president does a little bit, but on a much smaller scale. Like the President of the United States, the governor can influence legislation within the state of Missouri. So he gives a State of the State address to a joint session of the House and Senate, kind of like the State of the Union at the federal level. And he'll lay out policy objectives he'd like to be seen made into law. If the legislature is doing something he doesn't like, he can say, I wish he would rather do this instead. And so he can kind of talk about policy and what he would like to see the state government accomplish. The governor can also veto legislation, and that can be a powerful tool in convincing the General Assembly to craft legislation that he will actually sign if they want it to become law. It's much easier if the governor goes along with it, and so he can kind of bargain with them on shaping bills coming out of the legislature. However, if they can't reach an agreement, the legislature can override a governor's veto by a 2/3 supermajority vote in both houses, just like we saw at the federal level. However, the General Assembly does it a little bit differently. They will save up all the vetoes that occur during the time that the General Assembly is in session. Then they will have a special veto session before they adjourn, where they will try to override each one of the vetoes the governor has issued during the entire session. So they will just save up all those vetoed bills and then try to override them, all basically the same day almost. They will vote on them. So a little bit different, but it's the same basic kind of process. The governor has one power that the president doesn't have, and that's what we call a line item veto. When we're at the federal level, the U.S. president can either sign a bill or veto the whole thing. He can't get out a red pen and make changes to things he doesn't like. He either has to accept it as it's written or reject the whole thing, one or the other. The governor of Missouri, though, can veto a particular item in a spending bill. For example, let's say the legislature passed a bill that gave $10 million to upgrade the weapons for the National Guard, but also spent $5 million for an antique yo-yo museum. Okay, well, let's say that the governor is worried about this museum spending is wasteful. He likes the part about the National Guard. He doesn't like spending $5 million on a yo-yo museum. Well, he can veto just that one expenditure. He can take out his red pen and draw a line through that $5 million spending item and leave the rest of the bill intact. And so that's a line item veto. He can just veto one little bit of that bill. Now, these line item vetoes can only be used on spending bills, only on things that are spending money. And so he can't veto just anything as with a line item veto. He can't take his red pen out and draw his line, through something else. It has to be something that spends money. As long as it's spending money, he can do a line item veto. So if, for instance, they were going to change the name of a state park and he didn't like the new name, well, he can't use a line item veto on that. It doesn't spend any money. But as long as they're spending money on something, he can use that line item veto to veto just that particular item in the bill. So that's pretty cool if you're the governor, being able to help control state spending that way. Also, as we've seen, the governor has the power to call a special session of the legislature. We've already mentioned that. That actually happens fairly rarely, but it's a tool the governor can use to coerce the legislature into tackling something the governor thinks is extremely important. If the legislature, wouldn't deal with the problem when they were actually in session, the governor can say, okay, you all have to haul yourselves back to Jeff City and talk about what I want you to talk about. So he can kind of force them to come together and deal with the situation that he wants them to work on. For a couple of reasons, the governor of Missouri has a much weaker position within the state government than the president does within the federal government. And we'll look at why that is. And to begin with, I'm not talking about the president controlling an entire country while the governor just has one state. I mean, that's obvious. We can agree on that. But that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the way the system of government within Missouri is set up is different from the way the federal government is set up in such a way that it leaves the governor a little bit neutered compared to the president of the United States. It's just harder for the governor to run his own executive branch than it is for the president. And the structure of the system itself makes sure that our governor has weaker powers within the system than the president does within the federal system, really. The main reason for this is the governor cannot appoint a cabinet like the president can. He doesn't even get to choose his own running mate. And so he can't even choose the number two. The lieutenant governor is not chosen by the governor. He's just a person that runs for office on his own merits, basically. He is elected separately. And that's true also of the heads of the other major state agencies. And they're not appointed by the governor. They just run for office. They will file to run to be the Secretary of State or the Attorney General. And so they're elected by the people. And so the governor doesn't get to handpick those people who are actually running the major departments of the executive branch. And it's not uncommon at all to have a governor from one party and a lieutenant governor from the other party. As I make this video, we have that situation right now. The governor is a Democrat, the lieutenant governor is a Republican, and they hate each other's guts. So it's not that uncommon to have different people within the executive branch not getting along with each other. In fact, the governor and heads of the major departments may be political enemies. And they're all trying to run the executive branch together, but they don't get along. And so that's the way our system is designed, and it puts the governor on a much weaker footing by comparison, because the president gets to choose whoever he wants to run the executive branch of the United States government, but our governor of Missouri doesn't get that privilege. So the governor gets to make appointments to some positions, but the people in the most powerful posts, even within the executive branch, are elected on their own merits. So the governor cannot choose, for example, the attorney general, who's the chief law enforcement officer. That person is elected. They will run for office in a statewide election and get elected into office, just like the governor does. The state treasurer, who handles all the money, is not chosen by the governor. That person runs for office and gets elected. The same with the state auditor, who's kind of the chief accountant who makes sure the public money is not being wasted. The Secretary of State, who in Missouri does not deal with diplomacy with other countries like the U.S. Secretary of State, but they deal with matters concerning elections and records of Missouri corporations and other fun stuff like that. But all these people are extremely important in running the state government, and none of them get chosen by the governor. They are just elected on their own merits. And since the governor didn't hire these people, he can't fire them either. And that greatly diminishes his power over large parts of the executive branch. And so the governor can't really control his own branch of government even. He's the head of the executive branch, but all these people don't really have to listen to him all that much. And so even though he's the head of the executive branch, much of it acts independently from him. And so within the system, he's just in a much weaker position than the U.S. president is. Another thing that keeps the governor probably with less authority than the U.S. president is just because the governor is closer to the people. He's not as much of a star as the president is. Most people never get to meet a U.S. president in person, but they see him on TV all the time. He's probably the most famous person in the entire world. He's larger than life. Well, the governor is not larger than life at all. Usually when the governor is in town, there aren't throngs of people lining the streets to see him. You know, he's just down the road in Jefferson City. He pops into town every now and again to sign a piece of legislation or visit with the Rotary Club or whatever he's doing. But he doesn't have that star power. You know, cameras don't follow him around in quite the same way, and people don't turn out in droves to see him. And so he just doesn't have as much persuasive authority as the U.S. president does. So for a couple of reasons there, the governor is just kind of in a weaker position. One note before we leave Article 4 is that Missouri and 18 other states at last check allow for a recall election to remove the governor or other state elected officials from office before their term expires. And we talked about that when we discussed elections. But Missouri does allow for that. And so if the people get really ticked off at somebody they've elected into office, they can theoretically throw them out before their term expires. Let's move on now to Article 5, the judicial branch, our third branch of government. And that is, of course, our state court system. Throughout the country, remember, each state has its own system of courts working alongside the federal court system. We spent quite a bit of time looking at the federal courts and how all that worked from the U.S. Supreme Court on down. Well, each state also has its own court system as well. And remember, to get into federal court, your case had to be pretty special. If it was a criminal case, you had to be charged with a federal crime. If it was a civil case, you either had to have a federal question jurisdiction or diversity jurisdiction to get into federal court. Most cases don't qualify for either of those things. And so the vast majority of cases don't end up in federal court. They end up in state courts. And so state courts do a lot of work in handling the cases that come up within the country. Remember also that states have the primary responsibility for exercising what we call police powers, and that's just keeping law and order on the streets. And so most criminal cases also end up in state courts. And the most familiar crimes, murder, arson, rape, burglary, all that stuff, are state crimes, and they're charged and tried in state courts. And so the state courts just do a ton of work, handle a lot more cases than the federal system does, actually. At the very top of the Missouri court system is the Missouri Supreme Court. So just like the U.S. system has a U.S. Supreme Court, we have a Supreme Court as well. It has the final word on interpreting Missouri law. And so for most of the time, if we want to know what the Missouri Constitution means or some Missouri state statute, once the Missouri Supreme Court has ruled on it, that's it. They have the final word. The only exception to that is if somehow the law or Missouri Constitution provision that we're looking at somehow involves the U.S. Constitution, or someone's arguing that federal law somehow comes into play, then the U.S. Supreme Court could step in and do something different. But most of the time, the Missouri court system has, the supreme word on what Missouri law actually says. The Missouri Supreme Court consists of a panel of judges who spend most of their time hearing appeals, very much similar to the federal system. They hear very few cases, less than 150 a year, kind of like the U.S. Supreme Court. They're not lazy. It's just that there's only a few judges, and they spend, all of their time, reading these briefs and doing research and writing opinions, and it takes a lot of time to deal with even one case. And so they go through, 150 a year. That's actually quite a heavy workload, but they hear mainly just the most important cases, just like the U.S. Supreme Court does. They only end up considering maybe 0.5% of all cases filed in Missouri state courts. Most of them never make it to the Missouri Supreme Court. Usually only the most important cases. They deal mainly with specific kinds of cases. Death penalty cases they deal with all the time. And also those involving the Missouri Constitution. They will deal with those if they have to figure out what some particular provision of the Constitution means. And once in a while, just like the U.S. Supreme Court does this too, they'll step in to settle some kind of disagreement among the different districts of the Court of Appeals. If the different courts of appeal are saying different things, they'll kind of sort that out. Just below the Supreme Court is the Missouri Court of Appeals, and that's the intermediate layer that works very similarly to the U.S. Court of Appeals. They will hear most of the appeals coming up from the trial courts. Maybe 2% of the cases that are filed actually make it to a Court of Appeals. The Court of Appeals is divided into 3 different districts. We have the Western District, which is in Kansas City, the Eastern in St. Louis, and the Southern District in Springfield. And they will hear cases from the counties that are in their district. And each district is given about 1/3 of the counties in the state to hear these different appeals coming out of these different areas. Then at the bottom of the Missouri Judicial Branch, we have the trial courts, which we call the circuit courts in the state of Missouri. And they do about 98% of the work of hearing cases and coming up with verdicts and judgments and those sorts of things. These are Missouri's trial courts where we determine innocence and guilt for criminal cases or liability for civil cases. That sort of thing. We have judges sitting hearing cases, making rulings of law, and juries making finding of facts and rendering verdicts. And that's where nearly all Missouri cases start and where the majority of them end. Some of them are appealed, but the vast majority are not. For smaller rural counties, we'll have 2 or more of those counties joined together in one circuit. And so it won't just be one county, it will be more than one county in a single circuit that one court deals with. Well, each county will have a courthouse, no matter how small that county is. But the different counties in the circuit will share the same judge or judges. And so the judge will end up in one county on one day of the week and another county on the next day of the week. And court is held in those counties when the judge is actually in town. And so that'll happen quite a bit in rural areas. For example, Vernon County, where Nevada is, and Barton County and Cedar and Dade are all in one circuit. And so the judges in that circuit will be in Nevada one day, Lamar the next, Greenfield the next, and Stockton the next or whatever. So they'll just kind of make the rounds, go into these different courthouses on different days of the week. In the old days, a judge would get on a horse and spend his time riding the circuit and going from town to town. And so that's where that name circuit court comes from. And the idea of making the rounds, kind of like, the mailman makes the rounds. The judge would kind of go from one county to another hearing cases and going from one town to the next. Just as a local example, the 40th Judicial Circuit consists of Newton and McDonald counties. And so in that circuit, a judge will split his time between the courthouse in Anderson and the one in Neosho. Or maybe it's Pineville. I can never remember the seat of McDonald County, so forgive me if I got that wrong. But either way, they'll be in one county one day and the other county the other day. Then we'll have a larger county like Jasper County, and they're in a circuit all by themselves. That's where Joplin and Carthage are. We actually have 2 courthouses here, one in Joplin, one in Carthage. But it's only one judicial circuit, and so that's how they'll split up those circuits, is depending upon basically the population. And so one circuit may consist of multiple counties that will have to share the same judges. In the federal system, all judges are appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. But that is not how it works in the state of Missouri. It's different. Except in the big cities, the circuit judges are elected by the people. They run for office as Democrats or Republicans, just like the county sheriff or the town mayor, which is kind of interesting. You would elect a judge in that way, but that's how it works in Missouri. All judges have to be a member of the Missouri Bar. They have to pass the bar exam, have a law degree. But they have to run for office and be reelected, just like any other elected official. This has caused some kind of concern because it can create an appearance of an ethical conflict some of the time. And you can imagine why that is. A judge is essentially a politician, and politicians are famous for handing out favors and getting campaign contributions and things like that. And so this is a person who's supposed to be an impartial judge, who, justice is blind and all of that stuff. And so if he owes favors to people, that could be a cause for concern. You might worry about how impartial he might actually be. And so that is somewhat controversial, but most of our circuit judges are elected this way. The rest of our judges, however, are chosen in a much different manner. The judges of the Court of Appeals and the Supreme Court are not elected. They are chosen a different way. And Missouri invented this system, and they were so proud of it, we call it the Missouri Plan. And so this is a kind of a unique way of choosing judges that involves the people, involves some other stakeholders in the government, gives the people a voice, but they're not elected by the people in a way that would give us cause for ethical concerns. Here's how it works. The main criticism of electing judges, of course, is that they might have conflicts of interest and be beholden to campaign donors and stuff. So we want to eliminate that. Well, the Missouri Plan tries to remove that concern while still giving the people a voice in who their judges actually are. So what happens is when a vacancy occurs on one of the high courts, the first step in filling that is taken by a body of people called the Judicial Appointment Commission. And this is a nonpartisan group, made up of both Republicans and Democrats, who will try to figure out who we might put in that vacancy on one of the courts. And so they will look at a list of all the people in Missouri who are qualified to fill that vacancy, basically. They will then choose 3 of those names and submit them to the governor, saying, here are 3 people we think would work really well in this role. The governor again gets to pick one of those 3 people. So he does get a voice in the process, but it has to be one of the 3 people that the Judicial Appointment Commission chose. Then the person who's appointed takes office immediately and begins serving on the court. So it doesn't have to be ratified by the Senate or anything like that. Just they immediately start serving on the court. However, they're only there for a year, and then the people get a chance to boot that new judge out of office if they're doing a bad job. And so when we go to vote in a general election, we'll see a question on the ballot. Should we retain Judge Smith or whoever it is of the Missouri Supreme Court? Yes or no? And so the people will get to vote, do we keep the judge or not? And so the people have a choice about kicking that judge out of office or not. If the people vote yes, the judge will get to serve a full 12-year term on that court. If the people vote no, the judge is booted out of office immediately, and the process begins all over again. And so the Judicial Appointment Commission will sit down and figure out 3 names and so on, and go from there. At the end of that judge's term in office, their name will be placed on the ballot again. So after that 12 years is up, they will end up on the ballot again. Should we retain that judge on the court, yes or no? And so the people will again have a say in that process. Well, the Missouri Plan tries to have it kind of have their cake and eat it too a little bit. The judges never have to run it against anyone, so hopefully they're not beholden to any special interests. They don't have any conflicts of interest or anything like that. On the other hand, the people do have a say in whether to keep the judge or not keep the judge. And so the voice of the people is heard, but we prevent having just a regular old election and where we'd have those kind of concerns creep in. And what ends up happening, most of the judges that are actually appointed under this plan will stay around unless they do something so awful that it'll upset enough people to vote no. What people tend to do is if they don't know the judge, that usually means the judge is doing a good job, because usually judges only become famous when they do something controversial. And so people will normally vote yes, keep the judge, unless the judge has done something so awful to make them famous, So people tend to keep judges around unless the judge has done something bad and screwed up. So usually that's what happens under this plan. And so we get the voice of the people heard, But on the other hand, we don't contaminate the process with the normal, give and take of an election and all that stuff. So, all right, well, let's draw a line under that for now. That's part one of the Missouri government. I will see you again in part two.